The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the K-12 curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. Check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. The Remedial Herstory Project is funded through grants and by listeners like you. Please head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated. In particular, funds from patrons added from here on out will help us launch a crash course YouTube channel on women's history. We will be producing short 10-minute videos that educators can play in their classes telling women's history from era to era for both U.S. and world history. Let's make herstory together.
Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are introducing the next theme for the podcast.
All right.
Women in social reform.
I'm here for it. Let's get into this.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we are going to be introducing our second theme of the year, women in social reform. And Brooke, this is an essential theme when you're talking about women's history.
Tell me more, Kelsie. How so?
Well, I feel like if you think about it, when women have been excluded from power in a lot of ways, they then become sort of like the people outside of power advocating for those who need help with stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So most times women come into history class is in the work that they do advocating for various people who need support. People that come to mind that are like kind of classic in an American history class are Jane Addams, who founded the Hull House in Chicago for immigrants coming over to help them adjust to American life. Clara Barton, who founds the American Red Cross shortly after the Civil War, and then of course everything that she did during the Civil War.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, and those women like definitely make the cut of class, but they're not the only ones. And today,
they're not.
I know
I'm
they're
shocked.
not. In fact, women are pretty integral, and I would say every social movement ever.
I think you're accurate there, unless there's a male social movement we're missing.
Yeah. But even then, women are oddly there.
True.
I know. They're like, it's like, this is a men's movement for men. And some
women are like,
are,
here's your banner.
Yeah.
Good for you. Good for you. Keep marching. We've been out here for years. Good luck with whatever you're doing over there. Keep it up.
So today I want to introduce you to probably the most important women's movement in social reform, but also the most powerful political movement of the 19th century in American history.
Okay.
Before we get to that, I want to tell you a little bit about what's to come. We've got a lot of topics ahead in this theme on healthcare, medical care. We've got a lot of things on the settlement movement. So Jane Addams will come up again.
Okay.
I know for me, Jane Addams was something I was like, yeah, I know who she is. But we're going to go into depth on that movement broadly as well as her specifically.
Okay.
So there's a lot of really exciting stuff ahead. Oh, I didn't even mention like democratic equality across the globe, right? And
yeah,
so
just like buried that one down there. That wasn't your top billing.
No, I totally just spaced it. But and these are just a sampling of things that you could get into. And of course, there are many more than we'll get into in this theme. So
I'm excited for this theme.
Yeah, because it's powerful. I mean, we just spent the last few weeks talking about women in power, right? But a lot of times those monarchs, you know, they're barely like their throne is under threat.
Right.
You know, as it is. So they don't have a lot of opportunity to reach down and pull the women behind them up, right?
That really is not a theme until more recently.
Right.
You can't reach out when you're the only one there.
Yeah. What's great about the theme of social reform is we're actually getting into kind of the antithesis, right? You've got women on the outside working to challenge power.
Right. Well, and I think it's good that there is this topic because I think it often you highlight the powerful person and you forget about the narratives that help or the journey that got them there or who's supporting them or who's helping them move this needle forward or is even right alongside them as powerful as they are. And they more than likely are female.
Yeah.
So should be mentioned.
Something that I'm really conscious of that I'm definitely going to do today, by the way. And I'm going to talk about why it's bad, but hold that thought.
Oh, you're going to scold yourself on our podcast?
Yeah.
This will be interesting.
We talked in one of our first episodes of season 1, Heroes and Sheroes, about the problem of heroification. And one of the things when you get into social movements or like, any movement, right, you have to remember that there are dozens of people,
many people
behind that movement. And so like I mentioned Jane Addams specifically, but she's part of a larger movement for, supporting these immigrant people coming over.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of important to keep that context of, we're going to name a couple women over the course of this theme, and they're maybe representative of many people, but don't make the mistake of heroification and be like, this is quintessential or whatever. Today, we're going to talk about temperance.
Okay.
Temperance was the most powerful women's movement, more powerful than suffrage in the 19th century. And by the time, think about it, they were able, through the temperance movement, to pass prohibition, to ban the sale of alcohol in the United States, consumption, production, and sale of alcohol in the United States.
Can you imagine if that happened today?
Oh my gosh, it'd be wild.
It'd be wild.
So this is... it's a powerful movement. We're going to talk about a couple individual women, but it's important to remember that they are part of they're part of the masses, part of the many women that are behind this. And, depending on where you are and where you're teaching, you could find individual women who were involved in your local temperance organizations because there were many all over the country.
Yes.
And so you could look up those women, learn more about them, and connect what's going on at the national level. And we're going to talk about the national level more today with your students in your classroom, and what's going on in your state. So
interesting.
So today we're going to talk about temperance.
Okay.
And so temperance, alcohol, I kind of gave it away. What do you know about the temperance movement?
Not much other than it was like really done well in the marketing of it because it was basically like, they kind of positioned themselves like against the family unit if you were consuming alcohol. Yeah. And it was like, what a great opposition to have to be
you either like families
or you don't. And like, how dare, in the time period, the family unit, the core value of society and how you, establish status was the thing. And so if you were opposition to family,
like you might as well.
You were opposition to all. It crossed racial boundaries. It crossed religious boundaries. It was like multiplied by 1,000. Like, how dare you?
Yeah.
And there's definitely some groups out today that still try and position themselves against the family unit. And I think everyone's like, we're done with that.
So temperance reform really begins, it is a women's movement, even though there are lots of men that are involved in the movement. It really is a women's movement because, like you said, they're positioning it about, they're making this issue about the family, defending the family from alcoholism. And in a weird way, it's kind of interesting because they kind of, it's sort of like alcohol's to blame, not the abusers of alcohol, right?
Right.
Which, you could talk about how alcoholism is, like an illness, right? It's an addiction.
It is an illness.
So like, it is kind of interesting that even in that time, they were able to sort of like separate those things. But it's a women's issue because when you have excessive drinking, you have abuse, you have violence, and women and children were the primary victims of those things then and now. And so, So it really became not just a family issue, but like a women's issue. This is if you want to defend women, if you want to help women, you should be involved in this.
Yeah.
It's interesting because this issue sort of parallels suffrage in terms of like these two movements are taking off at the same time. And you've got sort of, you know, a lot of women who double dip, like Susan B. Anthony was a temperance reformer. But a lot of times people tried to keep the issues separate because it's like people felt like they had to sort of stay in their camp. And if they
couldn't cross the barrier.
They couldn't cross the barrier because if you did, you're not giving your whole effort to the thing that you care about the most.
Right.
Now this gets interesting. And the question that I want people to use, because I think it's a really good kind of compelling question to investigate, is should social movements be intersectional? Should you tackle different issues? And at the end of this episode, I'm going to tell you about how temperance really gets in trouble because they don't become intersectional in some ways.
Too isolating,
especially on issues of race. And so that's where we're going with this, just so you know.
Oh, I like to know where we're headed.
I'm going to start with white women, though. Ugh, classic.
Oh, man.
Okay. So, the temperance movement, also called like the Women's Crusade. So it literally has a name in books, you know, that's like ties it to women's history, right?
Right.
So it's called the Women's Crusade, takes off really like post-Civil War, and they become really, really active. They have a lot of petitions and demonstrations. For educators, for anybody, there's a really awesome Ken Burns documentary called Prohibition that goes into a lot of depth. And, you know, Ken Burns does a lot of like great documentaries, but this is like a very women-centered documentary that he does.
The thing I love about his documentaries is it's always a great narrator that just like flawlessly delivers the history that you want to hear. And it like drips from the microphone. You're just like, oh my gosh. Yeah. I don't even care what's on the screen. Tell me more.
Yeah. This is a very powerful documentary. I like it a lot. I've shown parts of it in my classes. This podcast is sponsored by our patrons. Patrons get access to behind the scenes, regular RHP gear, bonus episodes, insights into our research, lesson plans before everybody else, and more. Brooke, read off these awesome people.
Thank you to Jeff, Barbara, Christian, Kent, Jamie, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Anne, Sarah, Alicia, and Katya.
Woohoo! Do you know what is so awesome about this particular group of people?
No, what?
Very few of them are actually educators. These are badass people who care so much about equitable and inclusive education that they are willing to put their money where their mouth is.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so cool. You too can become a patron of the Remedial Herstory Project by heading over to www.patreon.com and becoming a sponsor of the Remedial Herstory Project for just $5 a month. That's it. That's one latte.
I mean, it's one of something, but it's cheap, and you get all that stuff.
All that stuff. You too can give up one latte for thousands of children and women.
You could also buy condoms for more than that.
You could reduce
reproduction for less than that.
Brooke, most importantly, instead of lamenting that women's history isn't being taught in high school or that they didn't know these women, these people are putting their money where their mouth is, and they are getting it into the curriculum by funding us.
It's awesome. And they believe women's stories are important.
Yes.
Thank you.
Duh. Thanks, patrons. We love you.
We do love you.
And so Temperance takes off during that time. The first real president of this time period.
Do tell. Who's in charge? Is it a white man?
No.
Shock. Oh, president of the Temperance movement.
So the major organization for Temperance is actually a women's organization. It's the Women's Christian Temperance Organization, and or the WCTU, as it would be called.
Don't love the acronym, but we'll allow it.
Okay. The president was this woman named Annie Whitmire, and she was obviously powerful within the organization. Yep. And so sort of the initial question about intersectionality is, should temperance embrace suffrage? So this is controversial because suffrage is sort of like, these women are getting political on the issue of temperance because they're doing that in defense of the family.
Right.
Okay. If you bring suffrage into it, now you're saying women should get outside of the family and into the realm of politics.
Yeah, they're oppositional.
It's sort of like, are those the same? Like, can you do both of those things at the same time? And certainly there were women doing both of those things, but Annie didn't feel like the WCTU should endorse the suffrage agenda.
Okay.
Because that was it's just a different aim, and maybe just don't blur the lines, don't muddy the waters.
And we have documentation that she did that.
Yeah, definitely. She does not support suffrage. And so I want to introduce another and probably the most important figure of the WCTU, which is Frances Willard. Frances Willard is part of the WCTU really early on, and is a champion for both suffrage and temperance. And she is...
a straddler.
Yeah. Her background is in education, and she is a firecracker. She has issues with one of the leaders of local Northwestern University, and she was working at a college nearby for women, and she like goes head to head with this guy who at some point they were engaged, so that's kind of fascinating drama. But
why
anyway,
are we leading with this story?
Yeah.
Just kidding.
So she just, she's a firecracker.
Okay.
And she comes in, she gets involved in temperance work, and she really wants them to endorse suffrage, right?
Yeah, like
and,
if you're going for a women's movement, these are women that should support other women.
Yeah, and like honestly, how fast could we get temperance if we had the right to vote?
Exactly.
They try to get...
it's like cart horse an argument with them.
Yeah. There's a trend that's developing around the country to give women the right to vote and be a part of school boards. And because, again, extension of the home, extension of the family, like maybe that. And so Frances Willard gets this idea, okay, well, if we can't like full on get the right to vote, can we get the right to vote on issues of temperance and that type of thing? So she tries to petition for that, and it fails. And it fails largely because she's being kind of like undermined by the fact that the organization entirely won't endorse this whole voting issue. So she ends up leaving the WCTU and is just like, I'm fed up, like whatever. And Annie steps down and she becomes the president shortly after that, which is kind of fascinating. So she becomes the president. They pretty much immediately endorse suffrage, and the two trains are forever merged, and they're moving forward together. So she champions both of these issues. And so in that way, she's pretty, she sees that there's merit in having different issues brought together, and that one can serve the other, right? I mean, a piece of temperance is really getting men to appreciate and respect the impact they're having on the women and children in their lives, right? And so if you can sort of deal with, if you can get that basic level of respect, then you can also maybe convince them that women should have the right to vote, right? Like these two things can go kind of together.
Right.
So she's a powerhouse. She travels all around the world. She gives speeches and lectures advocating for temperance reform. Like you said, the temperance movement is really, really powerful. And the one thing that you could do, depending on what grade levels you teach, for younger students, if you're having trouble getting them to access the idea of temperance, there are really powerful political cartoons.
This is what I'm talking about, like the marketing. It was like the first marketing campaign that women were in charge of, and you're like, damn, like that's impressive. Like you're just like coming for everyone. You're like, you, and you, bad people. If you don't get on our train, you're bad. And it's like, you're right, we're on your train.
my personal favorite cartoon is this one. It's called the alcohol toboggan slide, and it's this guy
Oh my God.
who like goes in. It's like it says something like one drink, and he just starts going down the slide. And the whole idea is like a slippery slope. But by the time this guy gets to the end of the toboggan slide, like he's gone down into deprivation, and now he's in like the devil's lair, of like it all starts with one drink, and there's no like
it's
stairway
the
back.
toboggan. That's how I'm going to feel about drinking wine later. Yeah. It's a toboggan ride. I'm on.
It's a toboggan ride. Well, and so to that, I do think it's worth talking about, differences in how people consumed alcohol then and how they consume alcohol now. So what
are the differences?
So, I have this timeline that goes all the way back to 1860. When it comes to wine, you're fine, Brooke.
Oh, good.
People have pretty much stayed consistent, and wine is like
the moderate.
Wine drinkers are the moderates, right? Who like don't consume
Finally,
that much.
I'm not an extremist. This is the best.
And by the way, the scale on the timeline is in gallons of alcohol consumption. Jesus. So, beer, interestingly, kind of like took off in consumption, went up, went down with prohibition, and then has kind of stayed in the middle. It's like 1 gallon to 1.5 gallons of alcohol consumed per capita. So what's interesting though, so that sort of like beer, wine, I don't know, pretty steady as she goes, I would say. It's when you get into spirits where things get crazy. In the 1860s, people were having 2 gallons of spirits.
2 gallons of spirit. That's
per capita.
Lot.
Which is more than double what people were consuming in the early 2000s when this chart ends. So if you can kind of picture that, right? Spirits, we're talking like hard liquors, right? Double what people are drinking today of hard liquors. And that's where we are in the 1860s when this movement is like happening.
There's also more people. Does that take that into equate? Or
Yeah, definitely. So it's per capita. So it's broken down per person. So and I think that's just sort of important context to keep in mind that even though we're not living in an era of prohibition, people are still consuming significantly less liquor than they were then.
Okay.
And prohibition is like definitely the turning point in that. There's a small peak after prohibition in the 60s and 70s, but it came back down again.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think that's because other forms of drugs are on the rise?
It could be. It could be because
there's a number of
drugs, maybe like legalization of marijuana in place, just different stuff that's sort of impacting what people do. But I also think there's just we have much more information out there, like I don't think most drinkers are like, this is good for me. Like it is a poison that you're putting in your body and it might be awesome, but like there's no like part of drinking alcohol that's healthy. Like
doesn't it lower blood pressure?
Yeah, okay. Like, but it's still.
These are the lies I tell myself. Kelsie.
Sure,
just lean in. All right,
okay, fine. Okay. She's crazy. No, so I think people are just a little bit more maybe knowledgeable consumers. We also have better access to clean drinking water. We have other alternatives, right? Like there's Coca-Cola. There's I don't know, all sorts of stuff that people can consume. So bringing us back to our women, the movement is really diverse and there's people all over the country. Some states are some states are able to pass prohibition laws state to state, right? So similar to lots of issues that we've talked about where they're trying to make change at a national level, it starts with state to state campaigns. And Kansas in particular, I think this is just such a hilarious one that you'd be remiss not to teach your students about.
Oh, do tell.
So in Kansas, they pass a prohibition law. It's illegal in Kansas to sell, produce and sell alcohol.
Deal.
But there's no enforcement of this law going on. And so there are bars like on the main drag in town that are operating and selling alcohol. And the WCTU in Kansas is losing their minds, right?
I can see, yeah.
Because it's like, this is illegal. Do something about it.
And then they're like, echo.
Yeah, exactly. So another woman that like everybody should know about is Carrie Nation. Do you know about her?
No.
Okay.
Great name, though.
Oh, yeah, there are puns. So Kerry Nation is a riot. So well, I should back up and say that her life is really, really tragic. She loses a husband to alcoholism. She's married a few times. I can't remember exactly how many off the top of my head.
Okay.
But she alcohol has defined her life, and not for the good. And she's a member of the WCTU, and she is devastated that these bars exist. She's also very, very religious, and so she wakes up one morning.
Surprising if she's been married so many times.
Well, they died. You know, these are yeah.
I'll allow it.
Yeah, although one of them's divorced. We'll talk about him in a second. So, so she wakes up one morning and she is convinced that God wants her to rid Kansas of this dreadful thing, liquor. And so she grabs a bunch of rocks and she goes into a bar and she just starts chucking them and shattering bottles everywhere.
Rage. Oh my God.
Like, this is like deep Christian angry rage.
Yeah.
Like, this is the real deal.
This is the thing.
This is the thing.
Good for her.
So she
girl.
goes in and
She hurt anyone?
that I don't know. You know, it's not mentioned in any of the
liquor bottle.
I don't think her aim was to hurt people. Like, she sees herself as going in to save people, right?
You're like, get out of here with my rocks.
She says at one point that this crowd gathered outside.
Ooh,
and
I can imagine.
This boy was in the crowd and he was looking up at her, and she had this idea in her head that, like, if you destroy the bars, you save the boys. That's sort of like, and so that like becomes very meaningful for her.
Yeah.
And so anyway, she's arrested, taken to jail.
Shocker.
And
So
which is just so funny though, if you think about the irony, like, these bars are illegal and she's the one arrested. You know, like, that's kind of messed up.
Didn't even think of that.
So she goes to jail.
You can't just come in throwing rocks in bars that are not supposed to be there. It's like arresting for fake act.
Yeah. Right. So she goes to jail. She gets bailed out. She immediately grabs a bunch of rocks and goes into another bar. And she just does it over and over and over again. And so her second husband comes in because he picks her up from jail one time and he's like, you know, he's not thrilled that she's doing this. But he goes, and you're like, why are you using rocks? You might as well use a hatchet. And so she's like, that's the most sensible thing you've ever said.
Oh.
She gets a hatchet and she goes into the next bar, and that sort of becomes the symbol of her things. And she called them hatchetations. And she would just like go in and chop up bars in Kansas. So she's arrested over and over and over again. The WCTU is like, we're not, like, we agree, but also no.
Your hatchetations are not on our agenda.
Yeah. But people like start joining her.
There's a hagitation crowd?
There's like a gang that like
the
starts
hagitationers
going around Topeka, Kansas, and then they move on to like Wichita, and they just like they go from city to
women
city.
with axes being a rogue.
Oh, it's amazing.
Can this
it's
thing
so
come back?
funny.
Maybe they don't like attack bars, but like I would really like to see a female gang with hatchets.
But like you have to have like a noble mission, you know? There's something about the like Christian, like I'm like dying for my cause sort of vibe that she brings. Because
I feel like they're out there. We could definitely
we got to find the cause.
We got to find these hatchet women. I bet they're around.
Yeah. So Kerry Nation,
interesting.
She's a riot, and you know, and just such an interest. You know, and we talk about like you need to have these examples of like powerful women in your history class, and like she's a badass who's like not afraid of the law. She's like, bring it on. You mentioned
obviously they can just keep arresting her and she gets out. There's no repercussions. Probably this time period, no women are in jail.
Yeah, well, there is I mean, women do go to prison and for different things. But there is definitely a tone of like respectable women should not be sleeping in prison. So bail them out, you know, and Susan Anthony,
like let's not let this happen for overnight.
Right. So Carrie Nation sort of becomes this joke. There's plays made about her and stuff like that. My favorite
there's a play?
sign,
is it a musical?
Well, I mean, in her time, they made plays about her. So,
oh my God. I can only imagine. I'm like writing the show tune in my mind.
There's a sign that I love that said, you know, and keep in mind, there's tons of immigrants coming over to our country during this period, 28 million over the course of
a few.
this time period. So there's a sign that I love that people started putting up in bars that said, "All nations welcome except Carrie." Pretty funny.
I really want that t-shirt.
Yeah. So Kerry Nation's interesting. Definitely somebody to bring up when you're talking about temperance.
Where does she end? Like, what's the end to her reign?
I think eventually she's successful in getting people to to some degree enforce.
Well, I mean, so the prohibition happens. So
eventually, there's nationwide prohibition.
So, I mean, she's probably ecstatic about that.
Yeah.
I wonder if Kansas ever got on board.
Yeah. So bringing it back to Frances Willard, by the 1890s, temperance is this massive, full-blown movement. And she, her passion, her enthusiasm has really made this movement a powerhouse movement. It transforms when she becomes president.
Okay.
And, but she becomes kind of controversial in the 1890s, and she dies in 1898, really young. She's 58. And that time period in her, the last years of her life, unfortunately, it kind of puts a black mark on her, like what I would argue is otherwise a pretty powerhouse legacy.
Okay.
And, like a lot of figures in history, she's one of those people that, you have to look at all of it. Mm-hmm. You have to look at the wonderful things that she did for this movement, the wonderful things that she did for women, for suffrage. And you also need to call her out on her racism and her failure to step up on different issues. And so another woman that everybody should know is Ida B. Wells Barnett. Ida Wells Barnett is involved in so many different things during this time period, including temperance, but she's a founder of the NAACP. Mm-hmm. She is a suffragist. The people who, might be familiar with her suffrage work, probably her most famous suffrage thing is in 1913 when Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and the National Women's Party are organizing their march on Washington mm-hmm.
For
President Wilson's inauguration. She gives a very passionate speech because they were going to segregate the different groups of women. And she's like, no, like we're either with you or we're not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like what the hell? And all of that was done to appease the Southern women because they wanted the Southern votes on the suffrage issue.
The audience can't see, but my eyes are rolled.
Yeah. And so she, she stands up and then she and many other women, including Mary Church Terrell, refuse to march in the back and they jump in where they should be. Yeah.
Right in the mix.
Yeah, exactly. She's involved in suffrage. She's involved in Black rights. And in particular, her passion for African-American rights is about anti-lynching. Okay. So she lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and 3 of her male friends were lynched by the KKK in Memphis, Tennessee, because basically there was this Black grocer who was doing very, very well. And he was competing with the white grocer across town and winning. And so they lynched him. And she knew these people, was devastated as anybody should have been.
Very traumatic.
And so she, her personal crusade is in anti-lynching.
Okay.
So eventually she ends up in Chicago. And she is a writer. She writes about anti-lynching. She publishes a pamphlet just with all her research and data and statistics about what's going on.
Amazing.
She speaks truth to power. I mean, she's such an incredible figure in American history and so under discussed in school. Everyone should know her name. And so she goes head to head with Frances Willard because she wants the WCTU to put anti-lynching as something
part of their
cause. That if you are going to stand up against domestic abuse, if you are going to stand up against violence, if you're going to stand for the family.
Yeah, this is all part of it.
That's all part of it. And you need to do that. There's a very public exchange between her and Frances Willard in the newspapers.
Ooh.
And so we have a lesson plan with this exchange on our website. And the question is the same question we should be asking for every social reform movement, which is, should temperance be intersectional? And, was Willard wrong for resisting, basically bringing this on? Eventually they do, Wells Barnett is able to put enough pressure on Willard that they do make some sort of like weak statement, but it just sort of highlights the ways in which temperance was a white women's movement.
Well, and it's powerful in what it was doing, but it didn't lean in on its power in the way that it could have and utilize it for more. It's like you already have this powerhouse of an organization.
It's the most powerful or women's political organization, and they wouldn't stand for lynching.
Yeah, it's like you have an opportunity here. You have the platform. Yeah. Like it's just utilize your platform. I think that's what we ask of anyone who's in social justice. It's like, you're on a platform, and yes, the cause that you started with is wonderful, but utilize that platform to lean in on others and make sure their voices are heard.
And not just people that are in social justice, anybody who has a platform, anybody that has an audience. Remember, you have a freaking audience.
Yeah.
And remember that audience is, looking at you as a role model. And even if you don't see yourself as that, like maybe that's not how you got your audience, you still are that.
You have a responsibility to utilize the platform. I know. We talk a lot about that with athletes today and, celebrities, social media influencers. Although you didn't get there for a social cause, you have one, and you should utilize it.
Yeah.
For good.
Yeah. So I want to end there. 1890. It's about 20 years before prohibition passes.
Okay.
There's so much to look into about that final push to get prohibition, and you could totally go there with your students. I will just say, I do think that it's really ironic that the first real women's amendment to pass is the Prohibition Amendment. 18 is prohibition, 19 is suffrage. And in a lot of ways, they thought that if they would give women prohibition, they would let go on the suffrage issue.
Oh, it's so cute.
That's really cute. So
just keep them quiet. Put them over there.
But I think it shows how under Frances Willard's leadership, the two sort of become synonymous. Like, and honestly, it sort of is, in some ways, a downside for suffrage. Like, what if we give you the vote? What are you going to do? Like ban alcohol or something? And like, yeah, they were going to do that.
And they did, and you helped them, and then they got the vote.
Yeah. So anyway, but it came in the other order, which I think is funny. I think it's funny that was more popular in the banning the sale and consumption of alcohol.
All, part of it, there was a lot more to do with the vote that was a challenge, uphill battle. But
yeah,
I do think it's so interesting if you bring in the imagery from that time period of it's just fascinating what people produced and what impacted people's opinions publicly.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Very cool. Well, what a great subject. So there is lesson plans on the website on this one.
Absolutely. Yep.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I'm Brooke Sullivan.
I'm Kelsie Eckert.
Thanks, Kels. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.